Hey, gang, ready to talk a little Napoleon? All right. All right. Napoleon short jokes are always funny. Okay. They may not be true. He was actually of average height. Okay. But he was of average height, and being short bothered him. And so because it bothered him, it was funny. And people made fun of it. There's political cartoons of him riding around on rats on his island. And he was called the Little Corporal when he was coming up through the military. And so he wasn't that short, but it bothered him that he wasn't tall. And so it's funny. So whenever you can make a good Napoleon short joke, boom, do it. Okay. So you have the schedule in front of you. We're going to talk Napoleon for a couple days here. We're going to talk some of what he did, um, and then we'll continue that tomorrow. Looking here at the schedule, sorry. And then already in a couple days he's falling. Already by Friday he's coming down. He comes back. Sorry, spoiler. And then he's gone. And then what's really important is the reactions to him, the legacy of Napoleon. What did Europe do after him and after the French Revolution that he kind of ties a knot on and ties a bow in and closes down. Um, and so you read about some of the things he did, and I of course want to highlight those, and those are important to understand. Um, but his significance really can't be overstated. Um, I am not a big fan of the great man of history theory, the idea that there's individuals that stick out and they make all the difference in the era. Uh, people point to Luther as that guy, and yes, he was a unique character, but he was just one of many angry Catholics who were upset at the church. We saw a bunch of them going back to the 1200s, Wycliffe and Huss. People going to the other end of the spectrum, people point to Hitler as like the great man in history. Like he was just another angry German. Like there was a lot of them at the time. Um, but with Napoleon, I make an exception. I think he was an exceptional person at an exceptional moment. And I don't know that we would have seen another one had he not made his way up. Um, so I want to talk about him as a person besides just what he did. So we'll do a little kind of psychoanalysis of him, a little bit of motives, a little bit of like, we're just going to get under besides just what he accomplished. But we'll make sure to hit that also. So if you go to the lecture now, we're going to start with a quote from Kagan, who wrote a three volumes, series on Napoleon, End of the Old Order, Napoleon in Europe. The middle volume, 1801 to 1805, is, if I recall, I don't have it in front of me, it's at school. I want to say it's 700 pages long. The man he already spoke French and German and English, and he learned Russian and a little Italian so that he could write these books. So if there's anybody who knows Napoleon um, in the modern era, it definitely would be Professor Kagan. Uh, and he says, no other figure besides Napoleon had distorted his era as much as Napoleon did. No other great leaders of the modern, excuse me, no other great wars of the modern world bear the name of the leader of a single belligerent. And I think that's interesting. We don't call them the Hitler Wars. We don't call them the Bismarck Wars for World War One. We call these the Napoleonic Wars, and we call this the Napoleonic era. And he's one of the very few people to have an era named after him. And so I think he's a singularly unique character that we need to spend some time talking about. Hey, he also is the only guy who has his own unit in our AP Euro curriculum, which never occurred to me until just now. But anyway, so I'm going back to the lecture. I want to put Napoleon on the couch here, the psychoanalyst couch here a little bit, and talk about Napoleon the man a little bit and where he was later in life. He really had an inability to recognize impossibility. Napoleon never believed any situation he was in was hopeless. He believed he could always get out of it. He continued to see opportunities, both military and political, whether he was on the battlefield or whether he was trying to figure out negotiations, long after others thought he was done. Um, which is a positive. Like you're gonna find good things, you're gonna find opportunities. But there's a negative side to it also. What happens when a situation really is hopeless? Like there's sometimes when you just need to live to fight another day. There's sometimes you just need to punt the ball when it's 4th and 35. Like, yeah, you could be creative, but just get rid of the ball and fight to live another day. Um, and I think we have to remember also that we're talking about men's lives when it's on the battlefield. We're talking about people's livelihoods when it's in negotiations. And so there's a positive to that, but the other side of it is, it's not so positive. Now, as far as his military genius, it was his remarkable agility and flexibility, mental agility and flexibility. He wasn't like a gymnast or something like that. A little too, no, okay. Um, he made a plan for a campaign. But most armies at the time would make exact plans for where they were going to stop, what they were going to do, even where battles might be. But Napoleon didn't do that. He made a plan for a campaign as a concept. But the plan itself was always changing, which is really hard to do. And we think about that and we're like, well, yeah, of course you would do that. But it's much easier to lay out a plan, to lay out an outline, to have other people part of it and everybody know their part in the plan. It's a lot harder to say, we're going to do this, and then when we get there, we'll figure out what we're going to do. But Napoleon's genius was that he was able to do that. He was able to keep a lot of ideas in his head about where his men were, where supplies were, where the enemy was, what the points of pressure were, what the threats were, where the vulnerable points were. And he was able to keep those all in his head, all moving at one time, and be able to adjust on the fly. And his opponents didn't really catch up with that very well at all. A third point about his personality is that once he started rising up through the ranks, once he started getting into positions, he felt he was entitled to more. He felt he was eventually entitled to be Charlemagne. He felt his ability, his intellect put him above everybody else, and he wanted the title to go with that ability. There was an Austrian emperor, there was a Russian czar, there was kings, there was this. He wanted to be emperor of Europe. That was his goal, and he felt it was, I don't want to say owed to him, but he felt he deserved it. And so that's just kind of a little look into Napoleon the person. Um, Now, real quick, I want to do this Napoleon's rise from republic to empire. This was all in your reading that you did the other day, so we can do this pretty quick. So Napoleon was he was from Corsica, which is down here on the map. It's actually an Italian island. He spoke with an Italian accent. He spoke French with an Italian accent his entire life. Um, his family was not a significant family. He didn't have many connections, didn't have anything to go on. Enlisted in military school, finished at the bottom of his class, wasn't real big into academics, but he showed ability. And this, I think, demonstrates the importance of merit and the French Revolution emphasis on merit and what that did and allowed him to rise through the ranks. He gave the whiff of grape shot, which helped save the revolutionary government, basically fired cannons on a crowd. Grape shot are like baseball sized cannonballs, and you put a rack of 6 or 8 of them into a cannon, and then you fire the cannon off, and it basically makes the cannon like a giant shotgun. And you have 7, 8 of these cannons, and it's really effective at dispersing a crowd in an awful, awful, violent kind of way. But that's where he helped bring his attention to the revolutionary government, where he was then sent to Italy and did some remarkable, remarkable campaigns uniting Italy, coming to closest, to uniting Italy since the Roman Empire. He then went to Egypt, where they were hoping to break the British, and failed miserably, but had really good PR himself, writing home about how awesome he was. And then things went really bad, and he just left. Um, and he had a really fast rise to prominence, basically. The coup d'etat, everybody répétez, s'il vous plaît, coup d'etat. Sometimes we just say a coup. It literally means blow of state, which I believe was in your reading. But what it means is bringing down the government kind of from the inside, as opposed to a revolution. 18 Brumaire, we're still using the revolutionary calendar. Essentially, he overthrew the directory with the help of some powerful friends, a couple of whom were on the directory, one of whom was the author of What is the Third Estate, and so some powerful friends. He then introduced the Constitution of 1799, made himself the first consul, which was essentially he was the boss of two other councils, which was very consciously modeled after the Roman government. And then in 1804, he crowned himself emperor. And your reading talked about this story about the emperor was going to crown Napoleon, and then at the last moment he took it from the Pope. Excuse me, the Pope was going to crown Napoleon, and at the last moment Napoleon grabbed the crown and put it on himself, symbolizing that he was in fact more powerful than the church. Now, whether this actually happened or not, or whether it's an apocryphal story, it still tells us kind of Napoleon's mindset going into this. And he was very conscious of his parallels with Charlemagne there. Now, one thing that I think is important to recognize at this point is that if you're looking at Napoleon's coronation from a Prussian standpoint, an Austrian standpoint, British, Russian, he appeared to be just another revolutionary government. Like, the other countries looked at him and they were like, well, yeah, of course a military strongman comes in. They've had like 14 governments in the last 9 minutes. Like, why wouldn't this happen? And so they really weren't that impressed with him. They thought he was just going to be temporary. They thought this was just going to be a momentary thing. But those calculations proved inaccurate. And so, but I think it's an interesting point. That's from Kagan. That's not my thought independently. That, they viewed him as just another one of these revolutionary stages, and we'll see what happens after him. Little did they know they'd be dealing with him for 15 straight years. And he was largely defeating them. Which is a great segue to our next point here, Napoleon's military conquest. How did he do it? In your reading, it's called Napoleon's Conquest. I say there is six reasons for Napoleon's success, how he was so militarily successful. I want you to take a moment with your partner and using your notes, this is a memory test, see how many you can come up with. Go ahead. I don't believe that you actually had the conversation to try to come up with the six. I'm going to sit here and wait until you do. Okay, that was a little weird, but I'm going to go ahead and make sure you got the ones that I was looking for. So one is the draft, the levy en masse that the National Convention started. It gave him a huge army. It gave them a lot of people who were training a long time, and that was a key component. I think it's also important to remember that the draft is a demonstration of social mobility, because you're bringing troops in who are able to move up and demonstrate their ability and move up, and that's a big point there. I think a second point is the nationalism of the soldiers. Your reading also brought that one up, very much in contrast to the conscript armies, as we talked about during the French Revolution. These guys were fighting for a cause, fighting for what they believed in, fighting for the great Napoleon. There was a lot of factors there. And then his leadership. He was a brilliant tactician. He was a brilliant strategist. He was a brilliant leader of men. The reading talked about how opponents said his leadership was worth 50,000 men. And that's a pretty unique situation to be in. Part of that was his ability to move his army fast. And this was one of his greatest abilities, his speed. He marched his army in two columns. Now, he foraged for food, which was mentioned in your reading. Forage is basically a fancy word for pausing, awkward pausing, for stealing. They would take food. They weren't bringing supply chains. They weren't bringing all their food. They were foraging. They were getting what they need on the way. Napoleon talked about how an army marches on its stomach. That literally, that'd be really slow. But they need to be fed. They need supplies. We're talking about, 20-year-old dudes, 25, 30-year-old guys. Like, they consume a lot of calories. Um, and so marching his army in two columns uh, separates divides in half the amount of food that each column needs. And Napoleon was unique in his ability to keep track of where each was, keep track of how far apart they were, where his artillery was, where his different units were. And that was just part of his natural ability, which gets me into the fifth one, which is also related to leadership and speed. And this one was the only one not mentioned in your reading, but Kagan really emphasized this one, was his master of logistics, his mastership of logistics. Um, One of Napoleon's most famous quotes among military men are is that amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. Logistics involves supplies, men, food, clothing, ammo. You need all the right bullets for all the right guns at the right place at the right time, making sure it's dry, making sure everybody is uniformed properly, has their gear proper. All of those take a measure of attention to detail, ability to keep many things in your head at one time, proper delegation and understanding who is doing what, and Napoleon was the best at it. That may be what set him apart from his peers more than anything else. Uh, and then the last point, and I think it's a really, really valid point that your reading makes, is the lack of coordination amongst his enemies. They were never fighting as one unit against Napoleon. Austria and Prussia are enemies of each other. They don't trust each other. Britain is never really part of a coalition. They're just constantly paying for coalitions. Russia doesn't trust either Prussia or Austria, which is fair because neither of them trust Russia. Britain doesn't particularly trust Russia either, and Russia doesn't trust Britain. Easy for you to say. And so they never really worked well together in trying to wipe out Napoleon. They all had the same end goal, but they weren't willing to move the same path to get there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what happened at Napoleon's conquest. So I'm going to start with the Peace of 1805 because this is his first big continental-wide victory where he just basically wipes everybody out. Napoleon completely defeated Austria in 1805. The peace he settled transformed Europe more than any since 1763. The treaties that ended the 7 Years' War, so basically a full generation earlier. Um, he dismantled the Holy Roman Empire. He broke Germany into three camps. There was Austria, there was Prussia, and then there was the third Germany. Now you can look at the map up here also. And Napoleon and his followers dominated the third Germany. His supporters dominated the third Germany. The third Germany was not aligned with Austria or Prussia. Those were the German states that didn't want to be part of Austria, weren't part of Prussia, didn't want to be. And this is going to fundamentally alter the balance of power in France's favor because now you have a divided Central Europe. Even more so than before, France isn't facing one solid opposition. He's got a state that is dividing the German states' potential rivalry to him. Then, after he defeated Austria again, Russia and Prussia in 1807, Napoleon was able to negotiate separate pieces. He didn't go into a room with Russia, Austria, and Prussia all at once. He dealt with each of them individually. And again, this was because of his genius, because of his mental agility. He was able to keep track of what he was offering, who and concessions he was offering, where, and kind of play the others off of each other. Um, and so the basics, what I want you to know about this piece here is he completely neutered Prussia. He completely defamed Prussia. It was left around basically almost as a favor. Like it was completely defamed, and he could have wiped it out and just kind of left it in existence as a favor to Frederick. This, by the way, is going to start an era of reform for them, which you're going to read about tonight. Um, his piece also isolated Austria, left them completely alone, and but basically left Russia alone, like let them do their thing. Napoleon had kind of a little, and I know this is a weird way to put it, but he kind of had a little bromance with Alexander. He thought Alexander was the man who was closest on the continent to him. Not quite to Napoleon's level, but the guy who was closest. And so he just wanted to let them do their thing and let them be. And he saw them as a balance to Austria and Prussia. And he figured, like, hey, Alex, you and me, we got a thing. Like, you be on this side, I'll be on that side. We don't have to worry about these crazy Germans in the middle. Sound good? Capiche? Boom. So now, if we look at the empire, knowing this map is going to be key here. The French Empire is obviously France. The lowlands that he considered part of France, parts of Italy, and then the Dalmatian coast over here, the coastal Balkans. So that was the French Empire proper. The Grand Empire included on this map what the map calls dependent states, which included Spain, the rest of Italy, this Confederation of the Rhine, and then the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which I call Poland. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the Allied states are Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And of course, they're only allied because Napoleon kicked their butt, and they had to be allied with him. And then significant enemies. And this got cut off here down at the bottom. There should be a D for enemies. Is Great Britain and Portugal. And yes, there were other enemies, I know, but I said significant enemies. Sorry, sweet, don't take it personally. Okay, I want to continue looking at the map real quick here. So I want to focus on that third Germany, the Confederation of the Rhine. That third Germany. You'll notice what's not here anymore, what Napoleon finally did away with, moved the lines. Holy Roman Empire. He gone. Moment of silence for the Holy Roman Empire. Thank you very much. So he just did away with that basically antiquated institution, the line that didn't really mean anything for a long time. He also created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. So if you remember, after the partition of Poland, one of the things we mentioned was that France really wanted a Poland. They liked having a strong Catholic ally in Eastern Europe. So they wanted a Poland. But Russia didn't want a Poland, and Russia was closer there. Napoleon felt he had this thing with Alex. So this was Napoleon's compromise. It was a Grand Duchy of Warsaw. It wasn't an independent kingdom. It was still part of Russia. But Napoleon's hope was that this would eventually become Poland. But it never really became anything because it was so far away from France, and Russia still just had it. And Alex didn't want it to do a thing. So whatever. But he created that. Created a kingdom of Italy, as I said, more united than any time since the Roman Empire. And until the next about 50 years, we're going to see that happen. But this is a big foreshadowing moment for Italy. Now, as your reading mentioned, one of the ironic parts of Napoleon also is that ruling time was family time. He appointed his brothers as rulers of Napoleon, of Naples and Spain, of Holland, of Westphalia, his sister, his brother-in-law, his uncle. And so all we talk about, and we'll talk about this in a little bit too, his merit-based society and his belief in merit and the proper, he really only trusted family, and he didn't want anybody who he couldn't trust explicitly running anything big, and those people were either people he bled with as fellow field marshals or relatives that he could feel that he felt would never betray him. I think it's important to understand that the army is still spreading the revolution, same way as we talked about before. This is just as Napoleon's armies are doing it. They're kind of doing the same thing, setting up sweeping reforms. So let's talk about those reforms, shall we? Now, Napoleon's reforms are modeled on the Enlightenment, or at least his version of the Enlightenment. I think that's important to understand. He called his system liberal, but that's questionable how liberal it was. Now, was it liberal compared to absolute monarchies? Sure. Was it liberal compared to what had come before during the French Revolution? I think you read about how questionable that was. He said he believed in a constitutional government, but his government was not limited. His government was all powerful. And if you remember our Hobbes versus Locke discussion, that was one of the big uh, proponents, or excuse me, one of the big aspects of Locke's uh, ideas is that there was a limited government. And, that's one of the big aspects of the Enlightenment, that people are good, people can improve. So this is one of those debatable moments of where Napoleon was. Now, one of the big important parts to understand about Napoleon is he believed in universal truths. Going back to our scientific revolutionary ideas of universal laws, our Enlightenment ideas of universal laws, of universal truths, all of these, Napoleon believed in them. And in a practical standpoint, he believed, and this is what I have as the arrow, that all people both wanted and needed the same legal realities. Didn't matter if you were French, Italian, Austrian, German, Polish, Russian, that everybody had the same legal concepts, the same legal realities. Now, with the benefit of historic hindsight, we can see that's not true. There's big differences between Roman law, Germanic law, Russian law, and those are just the three big examples. But Napoleon believed that everybody wanted and needed those same things. And the Napoleonic Code is his prime example of that. He wanted this standardized law code for everybody to use. And in that way, this is very scientific revolution, very enlightenment. Even if we look at the government and say, yes, he's an emperor, and yes, this, and yes, kings, that, but this idea of a universal truth and universal laws is very enlightened. So next, your reading talked about the Napoleonic Code extensively. It was called the Civil Code, if I recall correctly. What I want you to do right now with your partner is talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Napoleonic. And basically, I know your reading calls it the Civil Code. Everybody calls it the Napoleonic Code. So talk about the strengths and weaknesses. Maybe make even a little chart kind of thing, the strengths and weaknesses of the Napoleonic Code. Did you have a good long discussion about the Napoleonic Code? Because it's kind of a big deal, so I hope you did. Because laws are important. Those are things that the government does. Okay. The last point I want to talk about is the merit-based society. And this is kind of Napoleon continuing some ideas that started during the French Revolution. We're just seeing them come to the fruition. He is against everything feudal. He's again continuing aspects of reform from the French Revolution. You could move up in the military regardless of where you were born, regardless of your status of birth. There was really no noble privileges anymore. For the most part, he maybe pretty much got rid of that. There was no selling or hereditary offices anymore. Once again, mostly, but He was getting rid of these practices that had long been just part of the system, that so only a handful of people had any realistic connection or aspect or desire or ability to reach these positions. And by getting rid of nobility and nobility privileges, continuing that started during the Revolution, getting rid of selling and hereditary offices. These are other aspects that we're talking about a merit-based society. And then I think the last one to keep in mind is he encouraged schooling, and we'll talk about that in the next slide somewhere, or next day. Um, encouraging schooling in these lycées. If more people are getting educated and more people have opportunities, that's part of a merit-based society too. It's not just who you know; it's also what you know, and now everybody has an equal opportunity for that. So that is where we're going to end today. We will pick up with Napoleon and the church tomorrow and do the last bit of this. So thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it, you guys. Be good, and we'll see you next time.